Some mornings slip by without leaving a mark. Others carve themselves into your life, like a cut in soft leather, impossible to smooth out. That day began like any other, until the bell above my shop door rang, and in walked a stranger carrying the most expensive shoes I had ever laid eyes on. Shoes that were falling apart in a way that made my heart ache. The air inside my shop always smelled faintly of leather and polish, a scent I'd grown up with. My father used to say it was the smell of honesty, the kind that clung to you when you worked with your hands. But to most people, my little cobbler shop was nothing more than a forgotten corner on a forgotten street. The faded sign outside had lost its shine years ago, and the single front window was clouded from age, making it easy for passers-by to miss me entirely. I sat hunched over my workbench, the dim light pooling around me, a stubborn squeak in the stool beneath me, reminding me it was on its last legs. Like so many things in my life, rent was overdue again. The landlord's last warning sat folded in my apron pocket. My tools were old but familiar, the metal worn smooth from years of my hands holding them. That morning, I was repairing a pair of heavy work boots, thick soles, split leather, smelling faintly of mud. The repetitive work usually kept my mind from drifting too far into worry, but that day, my thoughts were heavy. The bell above the door gave a tired little chime. I looked up, and there he was. At first glance, he didn't belong in my world at all. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit so perfectly cut it looked like it had been sewn around him. Not flashy, no gold cufflinks or loud tie, but the kind of understated elegance that screams wealth without a single word. His hair was dark, brushed neatly back, a few strands falling forward like they had a mind of their own. But what caught my breath weren't his eyes or his suit. It was what he held. Shoes. Not just any shoes, handmade Italian leather, the kind I had only ever seen in magazines or on the feet of men stepping out of chauffeured cars. They were crafted with care, every seam placed with precision, every curve molded to fit perfectly. Shoes like that didn't just happen. They were a statement. And yet, these shoes were tired. The heels worn down almost to nothing. The leather scuffed, scratched, and creased from years of walking. The stitching had begun to fray, pulling loose in places like a secret slowly unraveling. "I was told you're the best," he said. His voice was deep, steady, with the kind of calm that doesn't ask questions. It expects answers. I stood, wiping my hands on my apron before taking the shoes from him. The leather was warm from his grip, soft beneath my fingertips. They told me a story, of streets crossed, meetings attended, miles walked with purpose. "They've seen some miles," I said softly, running my thumb along the worn heel. "They have," he agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Can you bring them back to life?" I met his gaze. His eyes were brown, but not the kind that spark warmth immediately. They were deep, shadowed, the kind that hold on to things, maybe too much. "I can try," I said. "If you're not in a hurry, I can do them while you wait." His brow lifted slightly, as if waiting was not a common part of his day. But then he nodded once, and moved to sit on the wooden stool in the corner. I began the work. The familiar rhythm of my tools grounded me. The careful pulling of thread through leather, the soft scrape of the awl, the slow application of polish. Normally, customers would glance at their phones or read a newspaper while I worked. Not him. He watched me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but with an intensity that felt personal, as though every stitch I made meant something to him. "You've been doing this long?" he asked eventually. "All my life," I replied without looking up. "My father taught me when I was 12. Said if you want to understand a person, look at their shoes." He tilted his head. "And what do mine say?" I paused, holding the shoe under the light. "They say you walk a lot, but you don't stay in the same place for long." His lips curved into a faint, amused smile. "You're observant. It comes with the job." The rain outside began softly, tapping against the window. Inside, the silence stretched between us, comfortable but heavy, like we were speaking in another language entirely. I could feel the questions building in my mind. Why would a man like him bring shoes like these to me? Why not replace them with something newer, cleaner, easier? When I finished, the shoes looked almost as they must have the day they left the workshop in Italy. The leather shone softly. The stitching was tight and secure, the heels whole again. I placed them gently on the counter between us. "There," I said. "They're ready." He picked them up, turning them over slowly in his hands. The faintest look of satisfaction passed over his face. Then he reached into his wallet and drew out a stack of bills, far more than the amount I'd quoted. "This is too much," I said quickly, pushing some back toward him. "It's worth it," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your work is worth more than you think." Before I could protest again, he set the money down, slipped the shoes into a simple black bag, and walked to the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped into the rain. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the extra bills on my counter. Most customers leave behind a polite thank you. He left behind a question I couldn't stop turning over in my mind. I didn't even know his name, but the way he had looked at me, like he could see straight through the dust and shadows of my little shop, unsettled me. At the time, I thought I'd never see him again. I was wrong. The man with the worn shoes was just getting started, and soon my quiet life would be unrecognizable. Most customers forget you the moment they step out the door. They carry their shoes home, and you vanish from their mind like a faint scuff buffed out of leather. But a week later, the man with the worn shoes came back. Only this time, the shoes in his hand were different, and so was the look in his eyes. The days following his first visit passed in the quiet, repetitive rhythm I was used to. Morning light slanted in through the narrow shop window, falling across my workbench in dusty strips. The smell of polish and glue clung to the air, and my hands, though calloused and aching, moved with the muscle memory of years. Still, my mind wandered more than it usually did. I caught myself replaying our brief conversation, the way he'd studied me as I worked, and the deliberate way he had said, "Your work is worth more than you think." It was such an odd thing for a stranger to say, especially someone who looked like he belonged to a world where value was measured in millions, not in the careful stitch of a seam. But as days turned into a week, I told myself it didn't matter. People came and went. Maybe he was just another face I'd never see again. Until the bell above the door chimed that afternoon. He stepped inside like he'd been here 100 times before, though the scent of his cologne, warm and expensive, the kind that lingered, reminded me how foreign he was to my little corner of the city. He was dressed much the same as before, tailored suit in charcoal, crisp white shirt, tie knotted neatly, hair swept back. But the shoes he carried this time weren't the weathered brown pair I'd repaired. These were black Oxfords, sleek and elegant, with fine stitching so precise it was almost invisible. The kind of shoes you might wear to close a deal worth more than my entire building. Yet the edges of the soles were worn, and the sheen of the leather had dulled from years of walking. "You again," I said, unable to keep the surprise. Or was it relief from my voice? He set the shoes on the counter, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "Me again. Think you can work your magic on these?" I picked them up, turning them over slowly, letting the weight and balance tell me their story. "They've been well cared for," I said. "They have," he replied evenly, "but everything needs a little help eventually." I gestured toward the stool in the corner, but instead of sitting, he leaned against the counter, his gaze scanning the shelves lined with jars of polish in varying shades of brown and black. "What's the oldest pair you've ever repaired?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "A pair of military boots from the 1940s. The leather was like parchment, cracked and fragile. They belonged to a man's grandfather. He'd worn them through the war. Every stitch felt like I was holding history in my hands. He tilted his head, intrigued. And you made them wearable again? I shook my head. No, I made them whole again. There's a difference, and you care about that difference. I met his eyes briefly before returning to my work. It's the only reason I do what I do. As I began cleaning the leather, he walked slowly around the shop. I noticed the way he paused by the wall of tools, some hanging neatly, others cluttered together in a haphazard tangle only I could make sense of. He picked up my awl, the handle worn smooth from decades of use. "These have been with you a long time," he said. "They were my father's," I replied. "Some even belonged to my grandfather." "They're old," he observed gently, running a thumb over the frayed grip. "They still do the job," I said firmly. "Why not replace them?" I gave a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Tools like these aren't cheap, and even if they were, money isn't something I have in abundance." Maybe it was the steady way he looked at me, or maybe I was just tired of swallowing my words, but I found myself saying more than I'd planned. "I've always dreamed of having a bigger shop," I admitted, eyes still on the shoes in my hands. "One with wide windows where the light pours in, new machines, enough space so I'm not tripping over my own work. Somewhere people can see the colors of the leather without squinting under a flickering bulb." When I glanced up, his gaze hadn't shifted. There was no mockery in it, no polite disinterest. He was listening, really listening, in a way that made my chest tighten. "And why don't you?" he asked softly. I shrugged. "Because dreams like that don't pay the rent. Not for people like me." He didn't answer, and for a moment the only sounds were the scrape of my brush against the leather and the muted ticking of the old clock on the wall. I felt a strange vulnerability hanging between us, as though I'd let him see too much. When the shoes were ready, polished to a soft gleam, soles reinforced, stitching tightened, I set them on the counter. He picked them up, inspecting my work with the same deliberate care he had shown before. Then his gaze shifted back to me. "Your hands," he said, almost as if tasting the words, "create more than you know." The sentence landed heavier than it should have, as if there was something behind it I couldn't see yet. He paid without even glancing at the total. As he slid the envelope of money across the counter, I caught the faintest trace of that same quiet smile I'd seen the first time we met, the kind that felt less like politeness and more like a secret. "Until next time," he said. I stood watching as he stepped back into the street, the afternoon sun glinting off the polished black leather in his hands. The bell above the door gave its tired little chime, and then he was gone. I lingered behind the counter long after he'd left, his words echoing in my head. Most customers brought me shoes. He brought something I couldn't name. Why would a man like that, who could replace anything without a second thought, care about a tiny, dim shop on a forgotten street? I didn't know it yet, but the answer would pull me into a world I had no business stepping into, a world where my craft was only the beginning. It was gossip that told me the truth before he did. The morning after his second visit began like any other, with the hiss of the old kettle on the counter and the faint aroma of burnt toast drifting in from the bakery next door. My shop was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every creak in the floorboards, every soft scrape of a shoe sole against the workbench. I was polishing a pair of ankle boots when the sound of laughter from the cafe across the street caught my attention. It wasn't unusual. The cafe was a place where people came to swap stories as much as to drink coffee. But something in the tone, that conspiratorial, slightly hushed excitement, made me glance up. Through the open door of my shop, I caught fragments of their conversation drifting across the street. Two men in crisp shirts sat at a corner table, leaning in toward each other like they were trading state secrets. "He's here in town for a week, maybe 2. Big meetings. Harrison Industries is looking to invest." "You mean the Harrison, Daniel Harrison, the billionaire?" The other man grinned knowingly. "The same. Net worth in the billions, owns half the buildings downtown. You'd know him if you saw him. Tall guy, dark hair. Looks like he's always in control." My cloth stilled against the leather. Tall guy, dark hair, always in control. It could have been anyone, but my stomach tightened anyway. I forced myself to look back down at the boots, but my hands moved slower. My mind replayed his visits, the tailored suits, the quiet confidence, the deliberate way he spoke, the way he'd listened. Minutes later, movement outside my window pulled my gaze up. And there he was. He was walking along the opposite sidewalk, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone loosely at his side. Even in the casualness of his stride, there was something about him. An unspoken authority, like he was used to people making space for him without him needing to ask. I didn't think. I just stepped to the doorway as he drew level with my shop. "Mr. Harrison?" I called. He stopped mid-step and turned, that composed expression on his face not quite hiding the flicker of surprise in his eyes. For a beat, we just looked at each other across the narrow street. Then he crossed over, the sound of his shoes on the pavement sharp in the morning air. When he reached the doorway, I didn't bother with small talk. "Is it true?" I asked. "You're Daniel Harrison?" His gaze held mine for a long moment, and I could see him weighing something in that silence. Then finally, he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "but I'd appreciate it if you didn't change how you see me." I raised an eyebrow. "Change how I see you?" "People treat me differently when they know," he said, his voice quieter now. "They measure every word, every smile. They see the money first, the person last, if they see the person at all." There was no arrogance in his tone, just a tired sort of honesty, like it was something he'd had to explain too many times. I leaned back against the counter, studying him. "So, why tell me?" He gave the faintest smile. "Because you asked me directly. And because I think you might actually mean it when you say you won't treat me differently." I thought about that for a moment. I'd never met a billionaire before, at least not that I knew of. But looking at him now, I didn't see boardrooms or private jets. I saw the man who'd brought me worn shoes because they mattered to him, who'd listened to my rambling dreams without checking his watch. "I can keep a secret," I said finally. His shoulders eased a little, though his eyes stayed serious. "Thank you. I like coming here because it feels normal. I don't get much of that anymore." There was a weight behind his words that I didn't fully understand, but I let it pass. Instead, I gestured toward the stool in the corner. "If you're here, you might as well sit. I've got coffee that's only slightly terrible." He chuckled softly, but accepted the seat. And for the next half hour, we spoke about things that had nothing to do with money or business. He told me he'd grown up in a small town, not much bigger than mine, and had lost his parents young. I told him about my father, about how the shop felt like the only piece of him I had left. There was something almost disarming about how easily the conversation flowed once the unspoken truth was out in the open. It made me forget, for a little while, that this man could buy and sell the building I stood in without blinking. When he finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "You really don't care?" he asked. "That you could probably buy my entire block?" I finished for him with a small smile. "No. I care that you bring me shoes worth saving. That's enough for me." His answering smile was slow, like it took a moment to warm. "Then I'll keep coming back." After he left, the shop felt quieter than usual, as if the air had been holding its breath while he was there. I went back to my work, but his words kept circling in my mind. I'd agreed to keep his secret without thinking about what it might mean. For him, for me, for the strange space that seemed to be growing between our two worlds. What I didn't realize then was that secrets like his don't stay hidden for long, not in a city where whispers can travel faster than the truth. And when the wrong people learned who was spending time in my little shop, they wouldn't see a billionaire looking for quiet. They'd see an opportunity, and that opportunity would come crashing through my door sooner than I could imagine. Some days, it feels as if the world itself conspires to push two people together. as though fate decides it's time to close the distance between them, whether they're ready or not. That day, fate arrived in the form of a storm. It had been raining since morning, a steady drizzle that softened the edges of the street and turned the cobblestones outside my shop into a slick mirror. By early afternoon, the drizzle became a downpour, the kind of rain that drowns out all other sounds with its relentless drumming. Water gushed through the gutters, spilling into the street in miniature rivers. I had closed the front door to keep the rain from blowing in. The bell muffled under the weight of the storm. My tiny heater hummed in the corner, fighting against the damp chill that crept in through the old window frames. Business was slow. No one wanted to go out in weather like this. I was halfway through, stitching the sole of a boot, when the bell gave a sharp, unexpected jangle. I looked up, and there he was. Daniel stood in the doorway, water dripping from his dark hair, his suit jacket plastered to his shoulders. His tie was loosened, and there was something almost boyish in the grin spreading across his face. "You're going to ruin that suit," I said, stepping out from behind the counter. "It's just water," he replied, shaking his head like a dog and sending droplets scattering across my worn floorboards. Besides, I was already in the neighborhood. I arched an eyebrow. "In this weather?" He shrugged, that grin still in place. "Maybe I wanted an excuse to see if you'd let me dry off here." I rolled my eyes but gestured toward the heater. "Sit. I'll make tea." In the cramped little back room, I filled the old kettle and set it on the stove. The sound of the rain against the roof made the space feel smaller, warmer, like the rest of the world had been washed away. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, Daniel had removed his jacket and draped it over a chair. His shirt clung to him in places, and I tried not to notice the lean lines of muscle beneath the fabric. "Your shelf is leaning," he said suddenly, nodding toward the wall where an old wooden unit sagged under the weight of boxes and jars. "It's been like that for years," I said. "I've gotten used to it." He stood, inspecting it like a man appraising a problem that could be solved with the right amount of effort. "Do you have tools?" I laughed. "Daniel, this is a cobbler's shop." "I have tools for everything." Within minutes, we were side by side, emptying the shelf and tightening its joints. He held the wood steady while I adjusted the brackets, his sleeves rolled up to the elbow, his hands steady and sure. The closeness was unexpected. Every so often, our arms brushed, and each time I felt the contact like a spark. When the shelf stood straight again, he stepped back and grinned. "Better." "Better," I agreed, though I wasn't entirely sure I was still talking about the shelf. We sat back down with our tea, steam curling between us. For a while, we just listened to the rain hammering on the roof, the sound filling the pauses between our words. Then, slowly, the conversation shifted. No longer about shoes or shelves, but about the pieces of our lives that shaped us. I told him about my parents, my mother's gentle laughter, my father's quiet strength, the way he had taught me to work with my hands. I told him about losing them both too soon, about how the shop had become more than just a business. It was the last place their presence still lingered. He listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his expression soft in a way I hadn't seen before. When I fell silent, he took a slow breath. "I lost my parents young, too," he said. "I was 15. One accident, and suddenly everything I thought I could count on was gone." His voice was calm, but there was something raw beneath it. He spoke of being taken in by distant relatives, of the loneliness that clung even in a crowded room, of how he'd thrown himself into work, building something from nothing, because standing still felt like drowning. It struck me then, how much of a person you never see unless they choose to let you. On the surface, he was all polish and composure. But here, in the warmth of my little shop with the rain as our only witness, he was just a man carrying his own weight of loss. We talked for hours. The storm outside showed no sign of ending, and neither of us seemed in a hurry for the conversation to stop. At one point, I caught myself studying the way the light from the lamp caught in his hair, the faint creases at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. The air between us felt different now, warmer, closer, threaded through with something unspoken. By the time the rain eased into a gentle patter, his jacket was dry, his tea long gone. He stood, slipping the jacket back on with an ease that made me suddenly aware of the fact that he would be leaving. "Thank you," he said. "For what? The tea? The shelf?" I asked lightly. He gave that slow, knowing smile. "For letting me in." I didn't answer, not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't trust them not to say too much. That was the day I stopped seeing Daniel Harrison as just a customer. And though I didn't know it yet, that shift would change everything. Because once you see someone differently, you can't go back. And neither of us was ready for what would come next. Good news travels fast. Rumors travel faster. In my neighborhood, they travel on the backs of everyday chatter, between the scrape of chairs in the cafe, over the steam curling from coffee cups, tucked into the pauses between greetings at the bakery counter. It didn't take long before Daniel Harrison's visits to my shop became exactly that. Chatter, whispers, speculation. The first few days after the rain-soaked afternoon felt lighter. My shop still smelled of polish and glue. The heater still groaned against the damp chill, and my bills still waited in a stack by the register. But something about the air seemed warmer, fuller. Daniel had stayed for hours that day, and I caught myself remembering the sound of his laugh, the way his hands looked steady and sure as they tightened the bolts on my shelf, the quiet weight in his voice when he'd told me about losing his parents. I didn't see him for 3 days after that, but when he did return, just to drop off a pair of well-worn loafers for new soles, I realized how much I'd been looking forward to hearing the bell over the door again. It was only after that third visit in as many weeks that I noticed the looks. At first, I thought they were harmless, passing glances from the cafe across the street when he stepped outside, a raised eyebrow from the florist when she saw him carrying a box from my shop to his car. But the glances multiplied, sharpened into something else, a knowingness. One morning, while sweeping the pavement out front, I caught 2 women from the building next door leaning together near the entrance. "That's him," one said, her voice low but carrying just enough for me to catch. "The one in the suit. He's been in and out of her shop 3 times already this month." The other woman chuckled. "Well, she's always been quiet. Maybe she's been keeping a little secret." I kept sweeping, letting the scrape of the broom drown them out, my face carefully neutral. My hands, though, gripped the broom handle tighter than necessary. By the end of the week, the whispers had shape, words given weight in the mouths of strangers. "Your rich boyfriend." The first time someone said it to my face, it was in the form of a joke. Mr. Collins, one of my oldest customers, dropped off a pair of battered loafers with a mischievous smile. "So," he said, leaning his elbows on the counter, "when's the wedding?" I blinked at him. "Excuse me?" He grinned wider. "That man who keeps coming in here. Tall, dark hair, sharp suit. Don't think I haven't noticed. Every time I pass by, there he is. Don't tell me he's just here for shoe repairs." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "He's just a customer, Mr. Collins." He said, clearly unconvinced, as he shuffled back toward the door. "If you say so." I told myself not to let it get to me, but the words stuck. Because Daniel was coming by often, sometimes with shoes that genuinely needed repairs, other times with no pretense at all, just to bring coffee, to share a story about a meeting that ran late, or to tell me about an old bookstore he'd stumbled across that he thought I'd like. I started noticing the small things, how his visits usually came in the late afternoon, when the shop was quieter, how his gaze would linger on the shelves as though committing every detail to memory, how he seemed to know when I'd had a long day, offering conversation without demanding it. The whispers outside the shop I could brush off, but the questions in my own mind were harder to ignore. Why was he here so often? What did he see in this little worn-down place, in me, that kept bringing him back? The answer didn't come, but something else did. My landlord. Mr. Keene arrived on a Thursday evening, his bulky frame filling the doorway. He didn't bother stepping inside, just leaned against the frame, his eyes sweeping the shop like he was already deciding where he'd put the "For Rent" sign. "Just a heads up," he said in his usual booming voice. "The rent's going up next quarter." I set down the boot I'd been working on. "By how much?" "Enough," he said vaguely, which somehow made my stomach sink further. "Costs are up. You'll get the notice next week." I nodded, but my mind was already racing. The margins were tight as it was. Steady work barely covered the current rent. A hike, even a small one, could tip the scales in the wrong direction. That night I stayed in the shop long after dark, sorting through orders, trying to calculate how much more work I'd need to take on just to keep up. The rain had started again outside, and I didn't notice the sound of the bell until Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. "You look like you're somewhere else," he said, stepping inside. I glanced up from the ledger. "Just thinking about numbers I don't like." "Bad news?" "Rent's going up again," I admitted, leaning back in my chair. "Mr. Keene says I'll get the notice next week, if it's what I think it is." I trailed off, shaking my head. Daniel studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, almost casually, "Maybe you need a landlord who believes in you." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He just gave a small, enigmatic smile, the kind that hinted at more than he was saying, and changed the subject. "What are you working on there?" I let it go, chalking his comment up to one of those vague, encouraging things people say when they don't know what else to offer. But after he left, I kept hearing it in my head. A landlord who believes in you. The words didn't sound random anymore. They sounded like a seed he'd planted, waiting for me to notice. The whispers in the neighborhood didn't slow down. If anything, they grew louder. At the cafe, I overheard someone saying they'd seen the two of us laughing together in the shop. The bakery owner joked that I'd soon be moving to a fancier part of town. Mrs. Patel patted my hand knowingly when I told her it wasn't what she thought. I laughed where I could, brushed it off where I couldn't. But alone in the quiet of the shop, the combination of gossip and Daniel's strange comment gnawed at me. I didn't know it then, but Daniel's words weren't a throwaway. They weren't even hypothetical. He meant every syllable, and the truth of it would reveal itself sooner than I was ready for. When it did, it wouldn't just change my shop, it would change the way I saw him, and maybe even the way I saw myself. He had a way of making me feel seen, even in the moments when I wanted nothing more than to fade into the background, to let the world pass without noticing me. And yet somehow, whenever Daniel was in my shop, his gaze cut through all the layers I'd carefully built around myself, landing on something beneath the surface, something I didn't even know was still there. But that afternoon, someone else looked at me and my shop with none of his warmth, none of his understanding, and in front of Daniel, they made the mistake of saying out loud what others had only whispered behind closed doors. It was one of those pale, overcast Thursdays when the sky seems to hover low over the rooftops, heavy with a promise of rain, and the light filtering through the dusty front window made the rows of shoes on the shelves look older than they really were. I was bent behind the counter, restocking bottles of polish in a careful gradient from deep mahogany to soft beige, when the sound of the bell above the door cut through the stillness of the shop. I looked up expecting to see Daniel alone, as he so often came, but instead he stepped inside with another man at his side. A man I didn't recognize. Daniel's presence was as steady as always, dressed today in a navy suit that managed to be both understated and impossible to ignore, the kind of tailoring that made you aware of the quiet, deliberate way he moved. But the man with him, everything about him was different. He was shorter, broader in the shoulders, with a stiff posture that seemed to push the air ahead of him. His jaw was sharp, his mouth a thin line, and his eyes carried that restless, evaluative quality I recognized instantly. The look of someone sizing up a room, not for its charm, but for its weaknesses. He glanced once around my shop, and I felt the weight of his judgment before he even spoke. His gaze lingered on the worn floorboards, the shelves crowded with mismatched jars, the workbench cluttered with tools whose wooden handles had been darkened by decades of use. "This is the place you've been talking about," he said to Daniel, his voice pitched somewhere between curiosity and disdain, though the curl at the corner of his mouth suggested he'd already made up his mind about the answer. Daniel didn't answer right away. His smile remained polite, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a flicker I would later recognize as a warning, before he turned to me and set a pair of shoes gently on the counter. "Yes," Daniel said simply, though I noticed he didn't look at the man as he spoke. The man, however, kept going, his eyes sweeping over me briefly before returning to the cramped space around us. "I can't imagine why you'd waste your time here," he said, the words smooth but edged, like polished steel. "It's quaint, I suppose, but hardly worth the kind of attention you've been giving it." The air between us thickened in an instant. My hand stilled on the counter, the bottle of polish I'd been holding suddenly feeling heavier. Heat rose in my chest, not the hot rush of embarrassment, but the steady burn of something far sharper. I set the bottle down a little harder than necessary and stepped around the counter until I was standing squarely in front of him. "With respect," I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of years of defending the value of what I do. "This shop has been here for decades. My father built a reputation here on quality, on care, on doing things properly the first time. I've spent years making sure that reputation is still something people can trust. I don't measure worth in square footage or how shiny my displays are." One of his eyebrows arched as though I'd said something amusing. "I can see that," he replied, the faintest smirk tugging at his mouth. I could have stopped there. Should have, maybe, but his tone had unlocked something stubborn in me. "You might think it's small," I said, my chin lifting almost imperceptibly. "But every inch of this place is here for a reason. Every mark on these floors, every dent in this counter, every scuff on these shelves, they've all been earned. People come here because they know their shoes, their memories, their stories are in good hands. That's not something you can measure with the same ruler you use for profit margins." He gave a thin smile, the kind people use when they've stopped listening but still want to appear polite. "Well, I suppose everyone has their niche." It was a dismissal, plain and simple. Daniel's voice cut in then, smooth as ever, but firm enough to end the exchange. "Come on," he said to the man, gesturing toward the back wall where a row of old leather boots sat. "I think you'll appreciate the craftsmanship on these." They moved toward the shelves, but I stayed where I was for a moment, my pulse still drumming in my ears, my hands curling into the apron at my sides. I'd had my shop judged before, by strangers, by friends, by family, but there was something about hearing it said aloud in front of Daniel that made the sting sharper. When the man finally left, after a quick, perfunctory circuit of the shop, Daniel lingered by the counter. "You didn't have to do that," he said, quietly, his eyes holding mine. "Yes, I did," I replied, my voice softer now but no less certain. "I don't care who he is or what he thinks. This shop may be small, but it matters. To me, to the people who come here. That's enough." Something shifted in his expression then, not surprise exactly, but something like a quiet acknowledgement. His lips curved just enough to be called a smile, but there was nothing casual about it. "That's why I like coming here," he said. "You don't need me to feel important." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I just went back to the workbench, and he stayed for a while longer, sitting nearby as I worked on the pair of boots he'd brought in. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It never was. But I could feel the weight of his earlier words settling in, their meaning unfolding in ways I didn't yet understand. Outside, the clouds finally broke, and rain began tapping gently against the window, the kind of steady drizzle that makes the rest of the world seem far away. Inside, the smell of leather and polish wrapped around us, the sound of my stitching thread punctuating the quiet. Every so often, I caught him watching my hands as they moved, but his gaze felt different from the stranger's earlier scrutiny. Not assessing, not measuring, but simply seeing. When the boots were finished, I placed them on the counter with care, and he thanked me in that deliberate, grounded way of his, as though each word was chosen, not thrown away. He pulled on his coat, took the boots under his arm, and stepped out into the damp evening. The bell above the door chimed softly, and then the sound of his footsteps faded into the street. For a long time after he'd gone, I stayed behind the counter, my fingers absently tracing the grooves in the wood, my mind turning over his words again and again. At the time, I thought it was just a kind thing to say, something I could tuck away alongside all the other quiet moments we'd shared. But Daniel wasn't just making conversation. He was already thinking ahead, already imagining something I couldn't yet see, something that would prove, beyond question, just how important he thought I really was. And when I found out, it would change everything. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that seemed to wrap itself around my decisions before I'd even made them. And without asking where or why, I found myself following him out of the shop and into the cooling air of the late afternoon. The day had been unremarkable until that moment. A steady rhythm of repairs and polite small talk. The hum of my old heater keeping the chill at bay. The faint smell of baking bread drifting in from next door. Daniel had stopped by near closing time, but instead of the usual exchange, shoes on the counter, a question about my day, he had looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd already decided something, and all I needed to do was keep up. We walked in silence for the first few blocks, the city settling into its evening pace around us. The light had softened into that golden hour glow that makes everything look touched by a memory you haven't had yet. The tops of the buildings warm with sunlight, the sidewalks cast in long shadows. I noticed the way people glanced at him as we passed, some with recognition, some simply because he carried himself as though the street belonged to him. After 10 minutes, we turned onto a street I rarely had reason to visit. The kind of street where the shop fronts gleamed, the awnings were freshly painted, and the air seemed to hum with the quiet confidence of money well established. He stopped in front of a corner property, its facade clean and bright, the tall glass windows catching the light in a way that made the space inside look like it was glowing. Through the glass, I could see wide, polished floors stretching back into an open, airy interior. The walls were painted a crisp white, the ceiling high enough to let the afternoon light flood in unhindered. It was, in a word, perfect. I turned to him, a small laugh slipping out before I could stop it. "What are we doing here?" "I told you," he said, his eyes on mine rather than the building. "I wanted to show you something." I gestured toward the shop. "This. Daniel, it's beautiful, but it could be yours." The words landed with such ease, such certainty, that for a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. I shook my head, the laugh turning sharper now, more defensive. "Be serious. This is not my world. Look at it. I couldn't even afford the electricity bill in a place like this, let alone the rent." His expression didn't change. "I am being serious." I looked back at the shop, at the sunlight pouring through those windows, at the space that could hold twice the workbenches I had now, shelves that wouldn't sag under the weight of years, a floor without splinters. For a moment, I let myself imagine it, the smell of new leather mixing with fresh paint, the sound of the doorbell chiming as customers stepped into a place that felt alive and full of possibility. And then, I shut the door on that thought, before it could take root. "This isn't a fantasy," he said, as if reading my hesitation. "It's an opportunity." "For what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "For you to have what you deserve," he replied simply. I turned back to him, frustration knotting in my chest. "Daniel, I appreciate that you believe in me. I do. But belief doesn't pay for a place like this. And even if it did, I've spent years keeping my shop alive with my own 2 hands. I'm not about to accept help, he finished, his gaze steady. Yes, I said. Not like this. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the street rushing around us, the hum of passing cars, the muffled sound of conversation from a nearby cafe, the faint clink of cutlery against plates. Finally, he said, "You told me once you've always dreamed of a bigger shop. With big windows, proper lighting, space to work without tripping over yourself. I found it. And I'm telling you, it could be yours. No strings attached." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to step through those glass doors and picture my name painted across them. But pride has a way of sounding like reason when you've carried it long enough. I shook my head again, softer this time. I can't just take something like this from you. It wouldn't be taking, he said. It would be accepting a gift. Same thing in my book, I replied, my voice tight. For a moment his jaw worked like he was holding back the words he really wanted to say. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking back the way we'd come. I followed, the silence between us heavier now, my steps echoing his in the dimming light. The shop faded from view behind us, but the image of it, the tall windows, the polished floors, the light, stayed lodged in my mind like a splinter. Back at my little corner of the city, he paused outside my door. "Think about it," he said quietly, then left before I could answer. I stood there in the fading light, the sound of the rain gutters dripping around me, staring at the spot where he'd been. Inside, the air of my shop felt smaller than usual, the ceiling lower, the shadows deeper. For the first time in years, I noticed just how much the floor creaked under my feet, how uneven the light was over my workbench, how the shelves leaned under the weight of too many years and too many repairs. My heart had already said yes back on that street, in front of those tall windows and that perfect light. But my pride screamed no, loud enough to drown out everything else. I told myself I'd made the right choice, that keeping my independence mattered more than chasing a dream someone else had handed me. I didn't know then how quickly circumstances would force me to reconsider, or how Daniel would be waiting when they did. Not every gift feels like a blessing. Sometimes it feels like a weight pressed into your hands, too heavy to carry, too costly to refuse, a thing that glitters in the light, but cuts you the moment you try to hold it. That's how Daniel's offer sat in my mind. I didn't sleep well after he showed me the shop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tall glass windows, and the way the sunlight poured through them, spilling across the polished floor like a promise. I imagined the smell of new leather mingling with fresh paint, imagined customers walking through the door and seeing my work displayed under the kind of lighting that didn't flicker or hum. But just as quickly as the image formed, pride stepped in to shove it away, whispering in its cool, steady voice that it wasn't mine to dream about. That dreams meant more when they were built with your own hands, brick by brick, penny by penny. By the next morning, I'd decided to tell him. No. He came by in the late afternoon, the familiar sound of the bell breaking through the quiet. There was no pair of shoes in his hands this time, no easy smile on his face, just a kind of steady anticipation, as though he already knew the conversation we were about to have. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, not bothering with pleasantries. "About the shop." He nodded, leaning against the counter, waiting. "I can't accept it," I said, each word deliberate. "It feels wrong." "Wrong?" His brows lifted, but his voice stayed calm. "Yes," I said. "You've been generous, and I'm grateful, but I've kept this place alive on my own for years. I've worked for every customer, every repair, every dollar. I can't just take something like that from you." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" "It's an investment," he replied, his gaze fixed on mine. "Not in a business plan or a property. In you. You said yourself this shop is your life. I'm offering you the chance to make it everything you've dreamed it could be." I shook my head. And what would you get out of it? His answer was so quick it almost startled me. I'd get to see someone I believe in succeed. The words hung in the air, heavy with a sincerity I didn't doubt, but that didn't make them easier to accept. Daniel, I'm not one of your companies, I said, my tone sharper now. I'm not some project you can throw money at because it makes you feel good. Something flickered in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a shadow of it, the kind that comes when someone feels they're being misunderstood. That's not what this is, he said, his voice tighter. You think I don't know the difference between a project and a person? I think, I said, that you don't understand what it feels like to have to fight for every inch. To know that if something is handed to you, it stops feeling like yours. We stood there in the thick silence that follows words spoken too sharply. Finally, he pushed off from the counter. I thought you'd see this for what it is, he said quietly. And I thought you'd understand why I can't, I replied, matching his tone. There was nothing more to say. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned toward the door. The bell chimed as he stepped out, and for the first time since I'd met him, he didn't look back. The rest of the day passed in a strange, unsettled haze. I threw myself into my work, the rhythmic pull of the needle through leather offering a kind of numb comfort. But the quiet between us, the sharp edges of it, lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. As I closed up for the night, I told myself I'd done the right thing, that keeping my independence mattered more than the light in those tall windows, that I could live with the cramped workbench, the uneven floor, the hum of the old heater. I had just finished locking the door when a shadow fell across the entryway. Mr. Keene, my landlord, was standing there, a white envelope in his hand. Evening, he said, in the tone people use when they have bad news but no intention of softening it. I took the envelope, the weight of it already telling me what I'd find inside. Notice for the new rent, he said. Effective next month. I'd start thinking about it now if I were you. I stood there in the dim light of the street lamp, the envelope cold in my hand, the ink inside still waiting to crush the air out of my lungs. All I could think of was Daniel's voice, low and certain. Maybe you need a landlord who believes in you. I had turned down his offer, but now it felt less like a choice and more like a mistake. What I didn't know was that the clock had already started ticking, and the days ahead would strip my pride down to its thinnest edge. 30 days to find a new shop, or lose everything. Those were the words staring back at me in cold, unfeeling black ink, printed so neatly it almost felt cruel, like the person who typed them thought that precision could make the blow any softer. But there was nothing soft about it. Not the number, not the threat it carried, and certainly not the way it sank its claws into my chest and refused to let go. I scrambled to find a place. All are too expensive, or too far. The morning after the letter arrived, I stepped into the streets with a determination I told myself was courage, though it felt more like desperation wearing a thin mask. The city stretched out in front of me like an unfamiliar maze, even though I'd walked these streets my whole life. I started close to home, scanning each block for windows with faded for lease signs, pressing my face to the glass of empty shops whose silence felt heavy and stale. Some were tucked away on corners where the air smelled of dust and disuse, others on streets so far from my customers they might as well have been in another city entirely. I made notes in a battered notebook, addresses, phone numbers, impressions, though most ended with the same frustrated mark. Too expensive. One landlord quoted me a monthly rent so absurd I laughed before I could stop myself, the sound brittle in the echo of the empty space. Another property, half the size of my current shop, carried a price tag I couldn't hope to meet without doubling my workload, and I was already working until my fingers ached each night. The few places I could almost afford were in poor shape, cracked walls that smelled faintly of mildew, flickering lights that hummed like they were tired of holding on, floors warped from years of neglect. I walked away from each one with the same zinking feeling. I was looking for a miracle in a city that didn't have any to spare. It didn't take long for people to notice something was wrong. My customers weren't just customers. Most had been coming to me for years, and they could read me like the scuffs on their shoes. Mrs. Patel was the first to say it outright, leaning over the counter while I wrapped her newly polished heels in brown paper. "You should call him," she said, her voice low but firm, like she was offering the most obvious solution in the world. I pretended not to understand. "Call who?" Her brows lifted, her eyes warm with something dangerously close to knowing amusement. "The man who comes here. The one with the kind eyes. The one who listens when you talk." I busied myself with the string, tying it too tightly. "He's not. He cares," she interrupted, her tone softening. "And even if you don't want his help for you, think about the shop. Think about what your father would say if he knew you had a chance to save it and didn't take it." Her words lodged somewhere deep, and over the next week, I heard echoes of them in different voices. The baker who handed me a bag of bread on the house. The cafe owner who watched me linger too long at the counter. Even one of the delivery drivers, who claimed he'd overheard more of my conversations with Daniel than I realized. "Call him," they all said, in words or in glances. The trouble was they weren't wrong. Not about him caring, and not about him having the means to help. And yet, at every time I pictured myself making that call, I felt something in me seize up. Pride is a strange thing. It's easy to believe its strength until it starts to choke you. There were nights I sat at my workbench long after I should have gone home. The shop silent, but for the quiet tick of the old wall clock, my phone in my hand with his number lit up on the screen. My thumb would hover over the call button, the air thick with all the things I might say if he picked up, and then I'd press the lock button instead, sliding the phone face down as if to bury the temptation. Each day without progress made the walls of my shop feel closer. The bell above the door, once a welcome sound, began to feel like a reminder of how soon there might be no door for it to hang over. I started packing things without meaning to, tucking away old scraps of leather, wrapping my father's tools in cloth. It wasn't moving, not yet, but it felt dangerously close to surrender. And all the while, the number in my head, 30, kept ticking down. 23, 19, 16. In the end, it wasn't me who made the call. Pride still had me by the throat, even as desperation clawed at the edges. But on a gray afternoon, heavy with the smell of rain, as I sat behind the counter pretending to read through a ledger I couldn't focus on, the bell above the door chimed. And there he was, Daniel. Not because I'd asked, not because I'd swallowed my pride, but because somehow he had known exactly when to walk back into my life. "You fixed more than my shoes," he said, the words landing in that quiet space between us where the air felt charged, the kind of charged that makes you think the next thing spoken might just change the course of everything. Daniel stood in the doorway, his coat damp from the drizzle outside, a small crease between his brows that told me this wasn't a casual visit. His gaze swept over the shop in that way he had, not hurried, not critical, but as though he were taking inventory of something only he could see. "I heard from Mrs. Patel," he began, his voice low, careful. "She said you've been looking for a new place." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the ledger in front of me suddenly feeling like a prop in a play I didn't want to be in anymore. "She talks too much," I said, but the words lacked bite. He stepped further in, the door swinging shut behind him, the bell's chime fading into the soft patter of rain against the window. "She said your landlord gave you 30 days. I met his eyes then, saw the truth of his concern there, and something in me faltered. 21 now, I admitted quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The shop was still except for the muted sounds from the street, a car passing through puddles, a muffled laugh from someone hurrying by. Then he said, "Why didn't you call me?" My laugh was short, almost bitter. "Because I knew exactly what you'd say." And that scared you?" "No," I said, though even to my own ears it sounded unconvincing. It complicated things." He moved closer to the counter, leaning against it, his presence steady in a way that made my stubbornness feel small and tired. "Tell me," he said, and it wasn't a request. So I did. The words came in fits and starts at first. The failed searches, the impossible prices, the way each day felt like a door closing in my face. By the time I finished, my throat felt tight, my hands gripping the edge of the counter hard enough to make my knuckles ache. And then, without meaning to, I told him the truth I'd been holding back. "I didn't want you to think I needed saving." He explains the shop is a gift, no strings attached, because my work gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Daniel didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I don't think you need saving," he said, "but I do think you deserve a chance to work without wondering if the ground's going to disappear under your feet." I started to protest, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish." He shifted his weight, his gaze steady on mine. "When I first walked in here, I'd just come from a week of meetings that made me feel like I was drowning. Everyone wanted something from me. Money, influence, decisions. And no one cared about anything but the bottom line. And then I came here, and you took my shoes like they were the most important thing in the world at that moment. You didn't look at me like a name or a number. You looked at me like a person, and for the first time in a long time, I felt still, like I could breathe." He paused, letting the words settle between us. "You fixed more than my shoes that day. You fixed something in me I didn't even know was broken." I couldn't look at him for a moment. My eyes burned, and I blinked hard, focusing on the grain of the counter's wood instead. "You don't owe me anything for that," I managed. "This isn't about owing," he said. "It's about wanting to give you something back. No strings, no expectations, just a gift." I shook my head, the old reflex rising. "Gifts that big always have strings, Daniel." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've already decided they won't let you talk them out of what they're about to do. "Not this one," I agreed, the word yes leaving my mouth before my pride had the chance to wrestle it back. For the first time in weeks, I felt the knot in my chest loosen, the air around me opening up as if the walls of my little shop had shifted just enough to let in more light. But I had no idea then what saying yes would set in motion, or how quickly my life was about to change in ways I hadn't even begun to imagine. I walked into the shop of my dreams, and there, above the wide glass doors, in lettering so elegant it felt like a ribbon tied just for me, was my name. Seeing it there made my chest ache in that strange, bittersweet way that only happens when something you've fought for, feared you'd lose, and barely dared to hope for actually becomes real. The move was a whirlwind, the kind of chaos that somehow feels like celebration even when you're too tired to think. Daniel was there for every step of it, his sleeves rolled up, hair a little out of place, carrying boxes as if he had something to prove. Though what, I couldn't guess. We packed the old shop carefully, my father's tools wrapped in cloth like they were precious artifacts, which to me, they were. Every jar of polish, every spool of thread, every shoe last was given its own place in the back of the van. I stood in the empty space before we left for the last time, letting my eyes trace the worn grooves in the counter, the scratches on the floor that told the story of years' worth of footsteps. "Ready?" Daniel asked gently from the doorway. I nodded, even though part of me wasn't. The new shop stood in the best part of town, the tall glass windows so clear it felt like they were inviting the sunlight in to stay. The moment I unlocked the door for the first time, the smell of fresh paint and polished wood wrapped around me, clean and full of promise. The air seemed bigger here, not just the space itself, but the feeling of it, as if the walls were built to hold ambition instead of just endurance. Daniel insisted on helping set up the workbenches, and I caught him more than once running his fingers along the new tools with a kind of reverence. "You deserve this," he said more than once, in that tone that made me believe him even when I didn't believe myself. Those windows became my favorite part. They caught the morning light and spilled it across the shop floor in golden rectangles, making every piece of leather, every polished heel, gleam like it belonged in a display case. Customers noticed, too. People who'd never wandered into my old shop now stopped to peer through the glass, curious, drawn by the warmth and the quiet hum of work inside. With the new tools, my work was faster, cleaner, and less punishing on my hands. The hum of the sewing machine was smooth and confident, the kind of sound that promised precision. For the first time, I had space to display finished repairs instead of handing them straight back, and seeing customers' eyes light up when they spotted their shoes, renewed and shining, was a reward all its own. Daniel, though by now I'd stopped thinking of him as simply Harrison, came by often, sometimes with shoes of his own, sometimes with nothing more than a coffee and a quiet smile. One afternoon, he surprised me by asking, "Show me how to do it." "Do what?" I asked, eyebrow raised. "Repair a pair of shoes, Akazij," laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was already pulling off his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. I handed him a simple job, replacing the laces and polishing a pair of scuffed Oxfords, and watched as he leaned over the workbench, listening intently as I guided him through each step. His hands weren't used to the work, but he was patient, careful, and when he looked up at me with a smear of polish on his cheek, I realized I'd never seen him more at ease. After that, he claimed a stool beside mine whenever his schedule allowed, working quietly in companionable silence. The customers loved it. The sight of the billionaire with his hands covered in leather dust, sharing the same bench as me, made for a story they told again and again. It wasn't long before word spread. People came not just for the repairs, but for the atmosphere, the warm welcome, the quiet hum of work, the way the shop felt like a place where things weren't just fixed, but cared for. Old customers followed me here, bringing friends and family. New customers came after hearing about the cobbler with the shop that feels like home. Even the neighboring businesses stopped by, dropping off shoes or just sharing coffee and conversation during slow afternoons. There was a sense of community here that reminded me of my father's stories, of the way a shop could be more than just a business. It could be a place people belonged to. And slowly, I began to realize that I belonged to it, too. I thought that was the final chapter. The move, the new space, the thriving business, all tied up neatly like a pair of laces pulled snug. But one evening, as we closed up, Daniel leaned against the counter, his eyes holding that same quiet certainty I'd seen the day he first showed me this shop. "There's one more thing I want to do for you," he said. And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Some words stay with you forever. They don't just echo in your head. They settle in your chest, weaving themselves into the fabric of who you are, surfacing in quiet moments years later as though no time has passed at all. That night, in the golden haze of the shop's closing hours, Daniel spoke words I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The day had been long, but good. A steady stream of customers, the warm buzz of conversation, the rhythmic comfort of familiar work. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops when I flipped the sign to closed and began sweeping the floor, the scent of leather and polish hanging in the still air. The bell above the door chimed softly, and I looked up to see him standing there, framed in the warm light spilling from the street lamps outside. He was holding a pair of shoes in one hand, worn leather Oxfords, their edges softened by years of use, the stitching frayed in places where the thread had given up long ago. "Cutting it close, aren't you?" I teased, leaning the broom against the wall. "Thought I might catch you before you left," he said, stepping inside and setting the shoes gently on the counter as though they were something fragile. Tells me he's investing in other small businesses inspired by mine. I examined the shoes, turning them over in my hands, feeling the weight of them, the way the leather had molded to their shape over countless steps. "You've had these a while," I said. "They've been with me longer than most things," he replied, his eyes on the workbench rather than me. "Figured if anyone could give them a second life, it's you." As I pulled out my tools, he added casually, too casually, "I've been talking to some people. Other shop owners, bakers, tailors, bookbinders, small businesses with a lot of heart and not enough help." I glanced at him. "You're investing in them?" He nodded. "Your shop reminded me of what work can mean when it's personal, when it's about more than profit." I thought, maybe I could do for them what I did for you. Something warm and complicated stirred in my chest at that. Pride, gratitude, and something else I didn't have a name for. I bent over the shoes, running my fingers along the seams, measuring the repairs they'd need. Daniel moved to stand beside me, his presence filling the quiet in that way it always did. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "some repairs last forever." I looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw that he wasn't talking about the shoes anymore. There was something in his expression, steady, unguarded, that made my breath catch. "Not all of them," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. "No," he agreed, "but the right ones do." For a moment, we just stood there in the low light, the scent of leather between us, the weight of unspoken things pressing in from all sides. I set the shoes down, gently, and started wrapping them in paper to keep them safe until I could begin work. That's when he said it, that quiet, deliberate sentence that landed like a pebble in still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew about where we stood. "There's one last thing I want to give you." I stilled, the paper crinkling under my hands. "Daniel, not tonight," he said, cutting me off with a small smile. "But soon. You'll know when it's time." I searched his face for a clue, but he offered none. Just that smile. Warm, sure, and infuriatingly unreadable. He left the shop with a quiet good night, the bell above the door chiming softly in his wake. I stood there for a long moment, the wrapped shoes in my hands, the rain beginning to patter against the windows. The street outside glowed under the lamplight, but inside, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the lingering weight of his words. One last gift. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know when it would come. But I knew, with a certainty that made my heart race, that, whatever it was, it would change everything. Again. If this story touched your heart, don't just let it end here. Join me for more moments that prove kindness can change lives. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments, what would your dream look like if someone believed in you?